So the suit against the police ended up being dismissed on qualified immunity grounds.
So what you're saying is regular law where there has been an established, like, I don't know, precedence, if you will. It doesn't matter if the precedence hasn't been asserted with police specifically.
So it depends on, it really comes down to the type of judge you get. So for example, in the Fourth Circuit that I'm in Virginia, there was a case where police killed a homeless guy. And recently the court denied qualified immunity, saying that you had a right not to be killed by police in those particular circumstances. But if you have a judge that is more police friendly, what they're going to do is they're going to look for any details that are missing in those prior cases that are present here as a way of trying to set the cases apart from one another. So if you use George Floyd as an example, the officer who suffocated him to death had his shin on his neck. It's not unusual for the cops to say, well, that's different. That he killed him with his leg. Prior precedent just says we can't, use a chokehold on them using our arms.
Okay.
And defense attorneys, we make jokes about it saying, oh, you're going to be entitled to qualified immunity in that case, just trying to be glib. But that's actually how it works. If there's any slight deviation from what has happened before to what has happened now, the courts end up getting qualified immunity. So Reuters did a story on this a couple weeks back where they looked at all of the prior qualified immunity decisions decided by the courts of appeals in the Supreme Court. And what they found is that 80% plus of every single use of force lawsuit, wrongful death, anything where the police have violated your rights, more than 80% of them end up being dismissed before the case ever happens.
Yeah.
Because the thing about qualified immunity is if the judge decides it's not a clearly established right, you never get in front of a jury in the first place. Yeah. You never get to go through what's called the discovery process to get evidence, depositions, that sort of thing. It just ends. Yeah. And when that happens, you lose the ability to establish new, clearly established cases. And so it just perpetuates this system where the police really can get away with murder a lot of times outright. Wow. For an extended period of time.
And could you give us an idea how pervasive the policy of qualified immunity is? That's something that's pretty much across.
Let me ask a different way, because right, we just had the Supreme Court essentially refuse to address qualified immunity. So we got like LGBTQ civil rights established, but it seems to me that like the civil rights in this police space, which is why all of this marching and protesting and looting is happening, like the Supreme Court just looked the other way. So in terms of prevalence, if talk about how prevalent it is and why you think the Supreme Court just decided to ignore it.
So the reason why the Supreme Court ignored it is because it's a problem they created. The initial qualified immunity concept, setting up that two-pronged test, they created back in the 80s. Then in the early 2000s, they changed it up. So instead of considering both prongs in order, where your rights violated, where they clearly established, they said, okay, to save time, a judge can decide either one first. So if you can just focus on the fact something's not clearly established, you can get rid of the case without ever even bothering to decide whether or not someone's constitutional rights were violated. Wow. And as part of that, you have the sequence of decisions by the Supreme Court expanding qualified immunity. It's not something that's found in any law. It's not part of the Civil Rights Act, which is what people are suing under. It's not part of the Constitution. It's something that the justices created on their own. They took this old good faith immunity we inherited from the British and tweaked it again and tweaked it again. And that's what we're stuck with.
And technically, judges aren't supposed to do that, right? Judges aren't supposed to create law from the bench. I mean, that's like
we call it judicial activism, but whether or not someone thinks that's activist or not depends on whether or not they like the outcome. So the way we're set up is that it's normal for justices and judges to establish tests when it comes to things that are within their power. So if the legislation they're interpreting, doesn't specify it, the judges have to deal with the lawsuit, so they'll come up with something. If it's dealing with, First Amendment type stuff, justices have created those things over decades in terms of, what is considered incitement, what is considered protected expression. Mm-hmm. But in this case, this is interpreting a statute where the judges just created it from scratch, just decided we're going to add this in and have continued to expand it over time. So the Supreme Court's never going to fix that because they created that problem. The last time the Supreme Court fixed the problem they created was Brown v. Board, reversing Plessy, and that took almost 100 years.
Yeah, 100 years.
So who does the public go to? Does the public go to Congress?
What would be the process for
fix
abolition?
This loophole?
Absolutely.
You got two main options. Getting rid of qualified immunity is going to have to be done by Congress and signed by the president. Okay. So that will actually handle it as far as the federal statute goes. What some states can do as an alternative, and you just saw this happen in Colorado last week, is actually create a state version of the Civil Rights Act. So what folks are suing under when police violate your rights, it's called the Third Enforcement Act, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. Wow. Congress enacted it to deal with the Klan. And because qualified immunity sprang out of that federal law that the judges were interpreting, it's going to take federal lawmakers to fix it. Gotcha. But what Colorado did is they said, look, we're going to take this federal statute and we're going to create kind of like a mirror image of it at the state level so that you can sue in state court instead of suing in federal court. And there is no qualified immunity. They didn't make that as part of their bill. So either option would work. The goal is to make sure that police who violate your rights can actually be brought into court. Accountability. And you can ensure that, you're made whole, because if you're not going to prosecute them criminally, civil court is where you're supposed to go as your backup to get redress.
Absolutely. That's all about accountability. And that's what we're about here at Politics in Black. So we got to power through, because you got some great points on this.
I talk a lot. Sorry.
No. I appreciate it. You're dropping gems just like you do on Twitter. But on the second point, requiring police to carry malpractice insurance. Now, this is one I've heard of before, and I've heard it described, doctors, pharmacists, other professions who work in life or death situations are required to carry malpractice insurance. Why not police? So could you speak to that? Like, why aren't police carrying malpractice insurance, and how could we get that to be a measure? Especially
in a state like California, where armed security guards are required to be bonded and insured.
Absolutely.
Yep. Well, lawyers are too. I mean, it's something we all deal with. So malpractice insurance exists. It just tends to be for smaller departments. So if you have a bigger department, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, they do what's called self-insure, which means that if they get hit with a big judgment, they're going to rely on the city council raising tax rates to pay for it.
Gotcha.
And the idea with having malpractice insurance is to kind of limit that, limit the ability to go raise your taxes to pay a judgment, but also to make it on a per officer basis. Mm-hmm. Because whether you love or hate insurance, one thing those guys are good at is figuring out how much risk you as an individual are going to create, and what are the odds of them having to pay out money for you.
Yeah.
So if you get an officer who's just accustomed to beating the daylights out of people and he's still employed, over time, he's going to be a bigger risk to that insurance company. The premium to employ him is going to go up, and it's going to force the department to make a choice. Absolutely. Are we going to keep paying for this bad officer who we like for whatever reason? Or are we going to cut him loose and go find someone else who's less expensive and hopefully abusing people's rights less frequently?
I love that idea. We got to make that one happen. Powering through still, though, Greg. Brady lists. So I had never heard of Brady lists before.
Yeah, before now.
Yeah. Could you talk to the people about Brady lists and why they're important and why they should be public?
Yep. So Brady versus Maryland is a Supreme Court case that says that if the government has evidence you didn't do the crime, it's called exculpatory evidence. They have to turn that over to you. A lot of times what will happen is that pretty much every DA's office in the country, they're not going to admit to it, but just about everyone has one. They will keep a list of police officers in their jurisdiction who have lied under oath or have been engaged in some sort of criminal activity, or for whatever reason, they can't testify as part of a case. They get put on a list, and that list is supposed to be turned over to the defense if you have a case where that officer is supposed to testify. And so what we're saying is that those lists, if you're going to give them to defense attorneys occasionally, the DAs do go through a lot of effort to hide them from defense attorneys as well. But they're supposed to give them to us. They really should give them to the public. We should know if an officer is lying under oath on the stand, if their reputation is so damaged they can't be trusted to give truthful testimony in court. The public should know who they are.
Absolutely.
And they should be able to say to the department head, look, you guys have a dirty cop. Why is he still working for you?
Yeah, that's a point I've been making, is that, we hear the narrative that not all cops are bad, right? And so my thinking behind that is that if not all cops are bad, let's identify the bad ones so that we can praise the good ones.
Right. Amen.
System. Yeah. Look at the system too. What is the system doing to allow? And these are some of the things. Down to the unions and the deals that the unions have. is one of the points that is on your 15, what we're calling the 15-point Doucette plan. But
we'll give proper credit.
We'll give credit wherever you want the credit to go. But yeah, the sweetheart deals with the police unions, and there in Los Angeles, there's something called budget advocates, and they go to all departments, and they're supposed to represent the stakeholders for the city of Los Angeles. And I was a budget advocate. We couldn't sit down with the police department without the union rep. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think Camden is the only, what Camden did is sort of what's making rounds in the news also. How do you advise municipalities or the people trying to get rid of unions? How do you do that?
It's tough, and part of that is because you have a lot of jurisdictions that are in favor of unions generally. So like you look at a lot of the states in New England, the states out west, they support all unions, and then police just kind of, come under their umbrella and use that to get perks that most anyone else doesn't get. And then you have the added challenge where both parties, and in states that have, more than two, pretty much all the parties, they all like police. Because if they criticize the police, they're going to be characterized as soft on crime and have a difficult time getting reelected. Or if you're at the city council level, if you criticize the police are going to be slow to respond to crimes in your particular precinct, your district.
Gotcha.
So it's incredibly difficult to limit their influence. And part of the way to do that really is kind of gathering information on what perks they get. So there's a website called checkthepolice.org that folks can go to. That for at least the bigger jurisdictions, they actually have the union contracts and they spell out what kind of benefits officers get. And really the goal should be just to treat the officers no different than anyone else. If you or I commit a crime, we're probably going to be questioned right away. Yes. We have the right to remain silent. We can, invoke our 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment rights. And then they'll stop questioning us and have us get a lawyer. But with most police situations, they can't even ask to talk to you until 2 weeks have gone by. Gotcha. And that gives officers, one, a chance to fabricate evidence, to coordinate with other officers on fabricating evidence. But then on top of it, if they are going to talk, their memory starts to decay over time. Mm-hmm. So eyewitness memory is notoriously unreliable, even with police. And we see that in study after study where you see witness identification being wrong, that sort of thing. Yeah. Well, go and try to remember something 2 weeks after the fact when no one has talked to you about it and we're trying to remember it 2 weeks later. It makes it incredibly difficult to get any useful information. So those types of protections, if an officer wants to invoke their right to remain silent, great. Ask them right after it happens to talk, force them to say, I'm invoking my right to remain silent. And then decide what you want to do with them from there. But giving them the benefits of like this 2 week wait time, not being able to talk to anybody without having a separate advocate there on top of the attorney they may or may not get. There's just all kinds of perks that the cities have been giving to these unions because they know that they feel like it's politically beneficial for them to do so. And it gets really entrenched and difficult to fix.
And we've seen some of the stories that have come, the false stories that have actually come out of, that extended time. I want to talk a little bit about the tail light policing because, yes. Sandra Bland was a tail light. Yes. We have so many of these incidents that were supposed tail lights. And one of my coworkers, he just said, well, if it's a tail light, we live in a world of technology. Let's just take a picture and let us send it in the mail. It's a fix a ticket, no contact, right? Talk about that I think we have just about a minute to wrap you out. We could keep you here for we
need more time.
The whole show. But talk about that because I know particularly in the Black community, in the ADOS community, the tail light is the gateway. It's like the gateway.
Yep. And the reason why is twofold. One, police use that to make money. Taillight policing is a huge moneymaker for government. You look in North Carolina, a baseline traffic ticket is going to cost you at least $188. And you will have hundreds upon hundreds of those in court every day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, times 100 counties. It's just a tremendous amount of money. It enables them to fund the judicial branch and fund the police without having to raise taxes. Yeah. That's a big part of why they do it. It's the moneymaker. Yeah. But then also they use it as a fishing expedition. If I pull you over because your taillight is out, you roll down the window, you're probably going to be nervous because you don't deal with the police every day.
Absolutely.
But a police officer can say, oh, you're being nervous. Based on my training and experience, that leads me to think you're committing a crime. Please step out of the car and let me go search.
Yeah.
And then I find, some Ziploc bags because you just went to the grocery store and you're going to pack your kid's lunch. But I can charge you with possession of drug paraphernalia because sometimes weed gets distributed in Ziploc bags.
That is.
And you see that it's just a way of getting people into the system and giving them a criminal record. And it's truly nefarious. It absolutely is ridiculous. And we use it to harm communities and make money when we don't have to do it at all.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is we have to follow the money.
Always.
Always, right? That's always the rule. Mr. Doucette, thank you so much for joining us. I wish we had more time with you today. We only got through about 4 points on your plan, but I want to encourage everyone to follow you on Twitter. You are a great follow. You are shining a light on things that need a light shined on them. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Please come back and join us again, and we can dig further into some of these other points because you are a wealth of information. Thank you.
Happy to do it. Thank y'all for having me. Take care.
Take care, Greg. All right.
That's the way I want to start.
So if you're not following T. Greg Doucette on Twitter, you definitely need to do that. Greg_Doucette, DOUCETTE, to find him on Twitter. So
I think we're going to go to break now.
We are.
Yeah, so we're going to take a quick break, folks, for 60 seconds. Give us 1 minute, and we'll be right back with more Politics in Black. And we're back.
And we're back at Morris Studios here in Leimert Park, Los Angeles, California. We are moving on Politics in Black. We just had Greg Doucette on the first segment. And for our second segment, we have from LAPD's Police Commission, Dale Bonner. Dale Bonner was appointed to the Los Angeles Police Commission by Mayor Eric Garcetti in August of 2018. Dale Bonner is the executive chairman of Planetary Concessions, a leading investor and developer of public infrastructure with its U.S. operations and headquarters in Los Angeles. A nonpartisan, Bonner currently serves as senior advisor to the Milken Institute and co-chairs the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation's Infrastructure Council. So we want to welcome Mr. Dale Bonner to the show. Commissioner
Welcome,
Dale
Mr. Bonner. Welcome.
And we also we're going to do a little East Coast, West Coast. We're going to bring from my hometown, from Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn.
Hey, all day, every day. Edwin Raymond, police officer at NYPD. Edwin Raymond, child of Haitian immigrants, joined NYPD in 2008 to work from the inside to remedy some of the injustices faced by young men. He rose through the ranks to become a lieutenant in 2018 and currently serves in my old town, Bed-Stuy. Woo woo. 2016, he became a whistleblower and lead plaintiff in an ongoing federal lawsuit with 11 other officers that exposed and denounced discriminatory police practices aimed at the Black and Latino communities. He is the subject of Emmy Award-winning Hulu original documentary movie, Crime and Punishment, and recently announced his candidacy for councilman of Brooklyn's 40th district. Not 81st. I'm an 81st district girl, but
welcome to
we're
the
gonna
podcast,
give you love
Mr. Raymond.
Welcome
to the
same,
podcast.
Mr. Raymond. All right.
So I think we want to jump right in. And Mr. Bonner, I'd like to start with you because you are local. You're in Los Angeles, and you sit on the Board of Police Commissioners. So could you just quickly talk about the board, what your role is in the law enforcement community here in Los Angeles, and then how you sit in a policy position for the LAPD.
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, the Board of Police Commissioners is a 5-member body that's established in the city charter, and we serve basically two dual functions. On the one hand, we are what you might consider the board of directors for the police department, and in that role enact policies and procedures and oversee the operations of the department. But we're also charged with representing the public at large and bringing that perspective, particularly as it relates to officer-involved shootings and serious uses of force and things of that nature. So it's really a dual role. On the one hand, managing the department, but also bringing that public perspective as well.
Absolutely. So we just got off with a North Carolina defense attorney, and we talked some specific policies. We didn't talk all of them, but we got through a few. But we talked about qualified immunity as one of the policies that have been identified as something that kind of stands in the way of accountability, of a police accountability. What's your take on qualified immunity? Have you heard of that policy? And if so, what's your take, and where does that stand in the city of Los Angeles?
I'm not an expert in the area. I know I'm familiar generally with the issues around it, and I did have an opportunity to review some of the ideas that the prior guests had put forward as well. And the way that I look at things, the qualified immunity and some of the other legislative proposals, they're very important checks and balances in the system. So I'm more focused right now on the front end of the system and how we address things either before or closer in time to the use of force. Things that, like qualified immunity and some of the other proposals, are things that come when there's a failure or breakdown in accountability in the department at the department level. Then you have an opportunity to go to the courts and address issues there. So I think it's an important part of the conversation in that regard, that no system at the department is going to be perfect, and so you need those additional checks and balances in the system.
Absolutely. And so talking about, before we get into the accountability piece of it, and I'm going to come to you, Edwin, what you have done in New York is sue the police department based upon what you called broken window policing and quotas. And could you talk to us a little bit about what that looks like in New York City and with the NYPD, and what was the motivating factor for you to bring that lawsuit?
Sure. Before I start, again, thanks for having this very important discussion. Thanks for having me, Commissioner. Nice to meet you. Broken windows policing. It's a theory. It's not fact. There's no peer review. There's no external validity. It's all theoretical. There's nothing empirical to back it up. But what happens is the former police commissioner in 1995, Commissioner William Bratton, who you guys had in the West Coast for a bit also.
Mm-hmm.
He's an academic. He reads this in an academic journal, and it has a common sense appeal to it, which is you over-enforce the innocuous infractions, and that will prevent the more serious things from happening. I guess to some that sounds like it could make sense. He absolutely loves it. He implements it in New York, and it becomes the new way. That couples with the creation of CompStat, which holds commanders accountable for serious issues within the jurisdiction that they're responsible for. So that portion of CompStat makes absolute sense. If the commander's not held accountable, then who is? But the problem becomes what's acceptable as a response. Mm-hmm. So if there's any type of spike in serious crime, any broken windows enforcement is responsible as the response. So you could have homicides or felonious assault shootings, and as long as you're getting innocuous infractions that are completely unrelated, as a commander, if those numbers are high, you get left alone at the podium during the CompStat meeting. Mm-hmm. And this literally creates a quota system, because now the commanders say, how many arrest summonses and stop and frisk should each officer have for me to create that buffer? So in case my crime increases, I'll be left alone at the podium. And because for all sorts of social issues, crime is higher, in certain minority neighborhoods, it's literally the paragon of systemic racism, where this policy is literally going to just overwhelmingly target blacks and browns, even though the behavior that they're being, held accountable for at the hand of the law is happening 3 miles east, where everyone's white. So that right there, that's a violation of the 14th Amendment, because it's not impartial. So broken windows policing, in a nutshell, is the over-enforcement of innocuous infractions with this belief that it'll stop bigger things. Sandra Bland being pulled over for a broken taillight. Yeah. Philando Castile being pulled over for a broken taillight. Even Eric Garner being stopped for supposedly for cigarettes.
I know, and the New York in me hated that. I remember being a kid and literally my mom being like, go get me a Lucy at the store. And you could do it as a kid. So his death in particular, it just, as a New Yorker, like the New Yorker in me died a little behind Eric Gardner, because I was like, that like became a thing, and now it's a thing that is resulting in loss of life.
And what I'm hearing from you, Edwin, is that although quotas are technically illegal, there's a culture that's being created through reprisals, through reprimands and things of that nature to make sure that revenue goals are being attained, which in effect are quotas by another name.
It's exactly what it is. It's almost like the perfect disguise for what it's really about, because it's easy to frame that as, no, we're trying to address crime. Meanwhile, those summonses becomes revenue, and in more complex ways, even those arrests becomes revenue. So that's exactly what the issue is. Literally another way to make money with black bodies.
Understood.
So Dale, can we bring you in here, because with the LAPD's budget, that's a huge topic. Black Lives Matter Los Angeles has certainly been vocal with the people's budget. And it started out as a response of 1,500 Angelenos that has turned into a response of about 24,000 Angelenos wanting to address the police budget. And LA spends, I think, $1.8 billion, which is a significant portion of the mayor's budget on LAPD. And revenues, for the most part, revenues here, I don't want to say that the ticketing thing is not a revenue center, but our largest revenue going into the general fund, which is where the police budget comes from, is from property taxes. But can you just talk a little bit about where we are with the different conversations you've had as a commissioner, where we are with what Angelenos want in terms of budget versus what the mayor wants versus what even city council wants at this point in time?
Sure. And let me start just broadly first by saying, I have been trying to understand myself, but also by asking others what they really heard from or are hearing from the protests that are ongoing today. And the mandate that I'm carrying away from those conversations and the protest is really one to not only to bring an end to police brutality, but also to dismantle the systemic racism throughout our criminal justice system. And I think from my perspective, there's, of course, a lot of issues to address there. But broadly speaking, one of the early things that we need to do is to look at the fact that police are the front end of that system. They exercise a tremendous amount of discretion as to who gets into the system for what reasons and in which way. So I think we need to first look at the front end of the system and with the goal of dramatically reducing the number of interactions that people have with police in the first place. So the fewer interactions you have, then the fewer opportunities you have for misconduct and brutality and all of the things that the lieutenant was just referring to. Now, one element of that here that's under discussion in Los Angeles and I think around the country is the idea of that it's just called a lot of different things, but the idea of defunding the police and investing in communities. And I think, my perspective on that, number one, is that it needs to be understood much more in depth than it is currently. I think it's fine in the context of the protest and the broader conversation to just get the idea, to get people to focus on the very idea of the institution of policing and what its status ought to be. But in the core of that in Los Angeles, with the $150 million that's being reallocated and some of the other things that are being discussed, is really on this question of starting to move certain functions away from the police and put them in the hands of unarmed professionals who are going to be better suited to address a number of incidences without the same degree of risk of violence. And what I'm troubled by a little bit right now is the fact that most of the conversation is around not only the dollars, but there's not enough conversation yet really about what that might mean. So we've already decided here in Los Angeles that we need to address that issue relative to incidents involving mental health, whether someone's having a mental health issue. We'd rather have a mental health professional respond than the police department. If there's other certain low-level kinds of incidences, we'd rather have someone other than the police department responding. At the same time, I'm not aware yet of any conversation as to who is that other, what is that other contingent of professionals who right now don't exist with the current level of certifications and training and all those things that would need to be in place in order to hand these functions off to that group. And so that's an issue that I'm going to be focused on.
And that also, for here, that's an intergovernmental issue because it's not just city council. I mean, when you start entering mental health, that is county. That's a county issue also.
Exactly. And so your point, as you're pointing out, the similar issue here with public health and mental health functions is there's a lot of other people that need to be involved. And so right now, it's I understand why the focus is on the police as an institution, and in some case, officers and the chief and those kinds of sentiments that are being expressed. But the broader issue really is if we are collectively saying that this is our moment to really achieve something more transformative than we've had an opportunity to in the past, then I think we really do need to start moving from the protest to really looking at the policy side of it and having that conversation, at least to understand what is it that the communities, the outcome they're trying to achieve, how do they really see this working? And then what can we really do? Because it's likely going to cost a lot more than $150 million, $150 million. And it's going to take some time to put it together. I think of it this way. It took about 3 years to dismantle apartheid in South Africa. Once there was a decision to do it. And I'm not equating those in the same way, although there's some elements I think that do apply. But I'm simply making the case that that now we can is the time to really start to really dig a little deeper behind that defund the police idea and start to put a plan together.
In that I want to stay with you, Commissioner Bonner, for a second, and I'm going to come to you, Edwin. But in that concept of digging a little deeper, in the lead up to this show, I downloaded and read your the Safe LA training and delivery plan. So it looks like that the city of LA and LAPD is focused on curating a more trained and kind of a better quality officer. Is that correct?
That's one part of it, yes.
Okay, so in that vein, one of the things that I'm always thinking about is back in 2006, the FBI issued a report warning us of the infiltration of white supremacists into law enforcement agencies across the country. And then in '91 in Los Angeles, the U.S. District Court found that members of a local sheriff's department had formed a neo-Nazi gang. And this is just two incidents or two examples of kind of what I see as a repetitive pattern of white supremacist ideology and activism or extremism that is popping up in our police departments across the nation. And so my question for you, Mr. Bonner, is here locally in LA, what has LAPD done to first cull out any extremist ideology out of the current police force? And then what are we doing when we're recruiting new officers and bringing new classes of officers in to make sure that they have no affiliations or no affinity for obviously what is a dangerous and terroristic sort of ideology?
Yeah, so on the first part, there is a tremendous amount of effort on the front end. If you think, I think it's for every 100 people who come forward to go through the process, I think it's maybe 4 or 5 who actually are screened in and permitted to even start the interview and the recruiting process. So there's the overwhelming number of people who come forward are screened out even from the inception. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because when you're talking about the effort to recruit more officers, black officers, for example, history has been, I think, some concerns around the discretionary elements of that screening and how it applies to certain people coming from certain communities. But nonetheless, there's a fairly rigorous screening on the front end. I think and then of course throughout the course of training and your service as an officer, there's in-service training, there's periodic reviews and consultations with the behavioral health specialists and others in the department. I think the way that I look at that is that it's going to be always going to be very, very difficult to find your way into the heart and soul of an individual officer, and we should continue to try to do that. But the fact of the matter is, I'm focused on the system. So even if those white supremacists or others didn't exist, the fact of the matter is that it's the system that is consistently producing an unacceptable result that is resulting in disparate treatment and disparate treatment of Black citizens. So I'm focused more on shoring up the training and strengthening those internal checks, but also making sure that we keep our eye on that broader issue, that even if we get rid of those officers, at least history shows us that we're going to still have this issue of brutality, because in many cases it is otherwise well-meaning officers who are either making the wrong decision in that split-second moment in the incidents of using force, or some other combination of factors that comes into play. So again, I see it as important to root out those elements of every department.
But it's a systemic issue in your estimation. Yeah. Absolutely understood. So, Edwin, I want to come back to you. And just recently, the police commissioner in North Carolina fired, I think it was 3 officers after they were recorded making racist remarks, such as one said he can't wait to start, quote, slaughtering Black people. I want to go back to your experience in NYPD, and obviously on the heels of the conversation and the response we just heard from Commissioner Bonner, is that your experience that there are these factions that hold this anti-Black American sort of sentiment, and is that rife within the police department or within NYPD in your experience?
The short answer is absolutely. It's yes. But to piggyback off the commissioner, I also often say the same thing. We can focus on individuals, which we should, because they need to be held accountable. But we have to, also mainly focus on the system that creates that individual in the first place. Mm-hmm. And everything goes back back around to the circle, because a lot of the issues in the policies and the culture are embedded from the time where people could be blatant bigots. Absolutely. And be, in law enforcement. So they're the ones that wrote the manual. So it's outlived them. And even though today the language is different, it's still achieving basically the same thing. But in terms of obviously being Black myself, it's going to be rare for me to be in a room where someone who has those feelings would share them. But, I recently went to LA twice. I went to LA twice this year prior to COVID becoming an issue. And it was only my 3rd time in LA. The first time I went was December of 2018. And I noticed the way we see, our brothers and sisters who speak Spanish, Latino and Hispanic brothers and sisters in the East Coast is very different from the West Coast. Oh. It's more of a bond, I would say, mm-hmm. in the East Coast. If anything, most Hispanics, Latinos are Afro descent, in the East Coast. Maybe that's why. But hold on. But we also have Hispanic brothers and sisters who can pass for white, as they say. And I've heard from them when they're in certain rooms, because they pass for white. Like one Puerto Rican brother who can pass for Italian, a white officer came up to him and said, speaking about all people in the Black community, said, these people need to be put in cages like animals and beaten daily. And he was mortified, and he was like, "What? This guy probably thinks I'm white, and which is why he's speaking to me this way," amongst other things. There's actually a recording 4 years ago of a white commander from another Puerto Rican cop who passes for white with an English last name, where he's very blatant who we need to target, why you're arresting white women, why you're, we need to target Blacks and Hispanics. So, it exists. It's here. It obviously, again, it's one of the things that diversity does help with, because it can still exist, but having one black cop around is going to stop that officer from behaving the way he normally would have, possibly, or having black supervisors, or just having more minorities around internally helps with that. But it definitely exists.
Yeah, comes back to the system.
And so, unfortunately, this segment, all of our segments today are moving too fast. I do want to sort of end with this thought. We have Yvette Carnell, who is one of the founders of the ADOS hashtag on social media, has a way of saying it's time for other people to eat the failure. And I think when you speak, Edwin, about the officer wanting tickets to be issued to just Black and Latino ethnicities and not the people who were receiving the tickets, that is equality and justice. That is equality and justice, right? When the justice is being handed out evenly through the population, and that's actually what we want to see. We don't want to see the African American communities sort of bearing the weight of all things legal when you have a film like the God of Wall Street, or whatever he was of Wall Street. And we also know during the time in the making of that film, I lived in Brooklyn, like crack cocaine was very real. But there was no policing of Wall Street like there was, policing on Malcolm X Boulevard. So I just wanted to end with that thought. But Dale Bonner, Commissioner Bonner, thank you so much.
Man, just one other quick point.
Please, go ahead.
If you'll hear us, I intend to highlight this. And I think that this gets to one other thing I hope that we can lift off the shoulder of Black people, not here in Los Angeles, but elsewhere. And that is that in the LAPD, they have, as part of their mission, their core values is to not only reduce crime, but also the fear of crime. And we talked a great deal about the importance of people feeling safe in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And one thing I think in the training and the other discussions throughout the department that doesn't always come through is the fear of police. So when you see these incidents on television, whether it's George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, or any of these, or Rayshard Brooks, I think some people look at those and they think either one, those are exceptions, or they look at the cases where the person wasn't killed, and they're thinking, they'll kind of get over that. And what I think the public health side of this discussion that's being missed is the trauma that results from the ongoing fear of police that you feel when you see them in your neighborhood in some cases, or they're behind you on the road.
At a stoplight, absolutely.
And that's an individual, it's a family, it's a community, it's a society impact. And so that's one of the things that you'll hear us talking about, certainly in my case, you'll hear me talking a little bit more about, is to help the officers and others to understand that opportunity to feel free of the fear of crime applies equally to the fear of misconduct and the fear of brutality, so that those who are now tuning in, particularly white Americans who are now investing the time and effort to learn why they need to stay engaged and why this conversation is important, hopefully they'll see that it's important to the development of young people who are in their communities. And it's as much of a public health issue as it is a law enforcement issue. So I'll be talking a lot more about that in the days ahead.
That's a great point.
Thank you for that. Final word, Edwin?
Just educate. I just want folks to educate themselves more about how policing works, so we can the response to the issues can be designed a little better. Sometimes I find that folks mean well, but sometimes what they come up with it's not realistic. And that's why we need more people who are critical to also join police departments. That's one of the main reasons I joined. I learned some things I thought I realized that I had to suppress. I learned other perspectives, but for the most part, a lot of my criticism stood because I've been a black man before I was anything else.
Amen.
And that's pretty much it. And Commissioner, we gotta connect. So when I'm on the West Coast,
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I think this has been a great conversation, and obviously we all have a lot of work to do to improve the situation and improve the system, but this is a good first step. So thank you for the time today.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Wow, we're cooking with gas now. Like I'm real fired up for this next one.
There's so many questions we didn't get in. I don't know.
Go.
We're gonna have to ramp it up, and we're gonna have some of our guests. I think we're gonna have to come back because these are going to be ongoing conversations.
Definitely. No.
We're not going to cure it all from the ADOS perspective here today, and so
absolutely. Well, we're going to power through, family, and coming to the podcast next is Connie Hassett-Walker.
Woo-hoo.
Connie Hassett-Walker is an assistant professor of justice studies and sociology at Norwich University in Vermont. She holds a PhD in criminal justice from Rutgers, and she previously taught at King University. Please welcome Connie Hassett-Walker to the podcast.
All right.
How are you today, Connie?
Oh.
We think you're muted right now. We don't have sound.
We don't have sound. And
hi, thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Hear you now, Connie. Good. We got that. We got that worked out.
And ADOS is so steeped in data. I think that because you are a researcher, like we are just pining to hear about some of your work, and I know Chad came across you in an article that was written as a result of George Floyd's death.
Yeah, as I was traversing the interwebs, I came across this article you wrote titled "George Floyd's Death Reflects the Racist Roots of American Policing." So it automatically grabbed my attention, and then as I was reading through your article, it was illuminating to me in the way that you talked about the history of policing in the United States. And so I was hoping that you could just start us at the origins and talk to us a little bit of what motivated you to write this article, and then what your research has revealed about policing in America.
Well, sure. If I just real quick, can you hear me now?
Yes,
we got you, Connie.
Okay. So I'm not sharing my screen with you, but I just have some notes up, so let me know if you can't hear me. I wrote the piece mostly because I wanted to educate myself. I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and the beating of Rodney King and the protests in the 1960s in the summers and Jim Crow. And I think these have to be connected. It's not a coincidence that America, as you got to be able to trace the DNA, so to speak, of the modern Black Lives Matter movement back to what sort of how you start is how you finish.
Absolutely,
yeah. So the end result of it was the piece that it was originally published in 2019, and then they republished it after the murder of George Floyd.
Okay.
But the reason I wanted to put it out there, and I'm certainly not the first person to write about this or to talk about this, Dave Chappelle in 2015. He was at the Knitting Factory in Brooklyn, and he did a skit where he talked about exactly these same things. I think it's a narrative that's known more to Black people than to white people, but the common narrative that's taught in intro to criminal justice classes is that American policing came out of British policing, and it started in Boston in 1838. And over the next 50 years spread to all the major cities to go along with the development of industry and influxes of people. That's the common narrative. The lesser known narrative is 100 years before that, beginning in the county of Carolina in 1704, you have the first slave patrols cropping up. And so slavery had been going on for about 100 years at that point, and the slave population in the southern states was growing. And so the white landowners were nervous that there were going to be uprisings and revolts and escapes. So they passed legislation to institute the slave patrols, which are the origins in the southern states of policing in the South. And it's something I didn't make it up. It's not like it's a secret, but it's just not something that we talk about a lot because it's uncomfortable to talk about. People can do terrible things to other people, but they don't necessarily like to talk about it and discuss what they've done. So that went on and it spread to the other slaveholding states, and it went on for about 150 years, right? And it ended in 1865 with the end of the Civil War. And then about 20 years later, you see the rise of the Jim Crow laws. You have the Black Codes for 2 to 3 years, and then those ended, I think, with the passage of the 14th Amendment. But then you see the rise of the Jim Crow laws that went on for 80 years until 1965, which is recent. That's almost my lifetime. So you have 150 years of slave patrol policing, 80 years of Jim Crow policing. Add them together, that's 230 years of systematic racism and violence of police towards Black people in America versus 1965 to now. That's 55 years of post-Jim Crow policing. So that the history, the ugly history, the violence is much longer than from 1965 to now. And there's never really been a reckoning for it. Policing in America is decentralized. There's no one central police agency that can set the policy for all the police departments across the country. And to an extent, they're dictated by state laws and the local culture. So there has to be modern police officers. It's not their fault of what happened in the past, but they have to understand they carry the burden of what's happened in the past, and they have to be mindful of that.
And that's almost what Edwin Raymond just said. He said that the people who wrote the book over 100 years ago, and during segregation or during Jim Crow. And so if that's the culture of a state, then that is inherently built into the system of policing as we know it. And when you say it like that in a historical perspective that you just painted, like the industrial prison complex is sort of not a surprise when you look at it in that way. I know I asked about this, and I hope you have the answer, but I read recently that during the Jim Crow era and the black codes and the leasing, the convict leasing that went on in the United States, there were 800,000 black men in that system. So we're talking like post-emancipation, the late 1800s, imagine 800,000 black men being in prison. And you don't see those numbers again until you get into the modern era where you see 700,000 African Americans incarcerated. And as Antonio Moore says, that is more women incarcerated. That number is more than all of the women incarcerated in all nations around the world. And if that is valid, I don't know if you were able to confirm if that was true, but if that was true, like, I don't know how you respond to that. How do we respond to that?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I did try to find that, and I couldn't. There are a lot of statistics from a lot of different sites. I couldn't independently verify it, which is not to say that it isn't true. Because where you got this, where the fellow who got the statistics, I'm sure he's pulling from a reputable site. That could certainly be. The history of prisons and being under correctional supervision in America also has equally terrible and racist roots. Yeah. And the thing that's troubling about it is not for black people in America is just Black people make up about 13% of the U.S. population, and Black men are 6 or 7% of the U.S. population. But Blacks in prison and jail and probation are something like upwards of 40%. So there's a disproportion. If Blacks are 13% of the U.S. population, they should be 13% of the prison population.
Absolutely.
But it's they're disproportionately arrested and sentenced and harsher sentences. And the war on drugs, which most criminologists would agree now, has been a big failure. It hasn't done anything to curb drug use. All it's done is put a lot of Black people, including Black women, behind bars, has disproportionately affected African Americans.
Yeah.
Just the one possible bright note is that I was looking at the trends in imprisonment of everybody has been decreasing for about a decade. So the disparity between Blacks and whites in prison has actually shrunk a bit in the past 10 years. And this may be because of a recognition that the harsh truth in sentencing, the harsh drug penalties just haven't been working in terms of they've just been throwing lots of people in prison and it's very expensive to do so. So the numbers of people in prison have been declining over the past decade. So if that's any bit of hope I can offer.
Yeah, Connie, I want to actually go back to the slave patrols because I think most people, we don't have a modern concept. I think you're right that within the Black community it's kind of common knowledge that policing originated in slave patrols, but obviously we don't have slave patrols per se on our street. So could you talk to us a little bit about what those actually were? I know they were a legally constituted, force. What were they actually allowed to do? What could they do? What was in their power?
Well, they're everything that you've heard of the overseer on the plantation who would whip the slaves and terrorize the slaves. Everything the overseer could do, the group of men, largely white men, on the slave patrols could do. Their job was to round up escaped slaves, check papers for if a slave was traveling. They needed to have papers from their owner that said that they were allowed to be out if their owner had. And I apologize for using the word; it's a terrible word. The slave owner, if they had not given them the papers that allowed them to travel, the slave could be beaten, returned to the plantation where they were supposed to be. They were supposed to quell uprisings. They were just supposed to terrorize people to keep them in line. And implicit in that, to me, is that the white Southern slave owners knew that they didn't think of slaves as full people, but they knew that it was bad, and they knew what they were doing wasn't, the slaves didn't like it. So they needed to their job was to terrorize and discipline.
Keep fear.
Yeah, and I want to call out just one additional point that you made in your article. You said that slave patrols could forcibly enter anyone's home, regardless of their race, based on suspicions that they were sheltering people who had escaped bondage. That sounds a lot to me like no-knock warrants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so what I'm getting at, I guess, it seems like there's a lot of parallels in what we saw in, antebellum and just after emancipation with policing, and when we talk about quotas and trying to, make sure that we had a prison that was available for labor in certain respects. Seems to be a lot of parallels between the 1860s and the 2020. Would you agree?
I had not thought of it as like no-knock warrants, but you make a good point. My sadness is that we just haven't come far enough, that it's the pictures that are taken of the protests nowadays really could be pictures from the 1960s in the summer.
Absolutely.
And, Newark and Plainfield and Los Angeles and all the places where protests and rioting were happening. Policing is a militaristic sort of top-down chain of command structure, and it doesn't lend itself real well to change. My hope is that now, because there's so much pressure, that there will be an impetus to change. I really hope that the police unions, which can be an impediment to change, will take this on and take ownership of the issue.
Yeah.
Because the police are supposed to protect and serve.
Yes.
And most of the officers that I've talked to were just, the word that kept coming up about the George Floyd video was it was disgusting. They were just discussed. That's not supposed to happen. But of course, things like this do happen. And if it was just one isolated incident, that's one thing. But it's all the people who came before him, including people whose names are less known. So things have not evolved as far as they should. And if anything good can come out of George Floyd's murder, perhaps there can be real reform.
Absolutely.
I think some of the unions are going to, though, have to also go through their own development. There's a certain amount of change that just comes with time. But a lot of the police unions, a lot of the fire unions across the United States were actually formed during segregation. And so with that, I've looked at union photos, because unions like to talk about their history, and they'll have, something from the 1920s, and it will be all white men in terms of running the union. And if you look today in 2020, it might be more people, but the image is almost the same. And I think that when it comes to, there's a saying, power is not conceded to you. You can't just ask for power and it be granted. But I think with
not without demand.
With some of these unions, and as the makeup of different police bodies and different fire departmental bodies change, it also the leadership has to ultimately change. A little bit.
Absolutely. The leadership has to change both in the unions and in police departments. And my feeling is it's not enough just to hire more Black officers. You need to have promotions to supervisory positions. How do you change a culture and a history? It's not an easy answer, and it's not just one thing. You need to have better training. You need to have officers living in the communities where they police. There have to be consequences for bad behavior. Unions need to take it on. I think it's fixable. That's, I'm an optimist by nature. So my hope is that it can be fixed, and it will, that progress over time. I'm hopeful.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Connie, for joining us today. I really like getting a historical perspective here at Politics in Black, and I appreciate you bringing that to the show. I think you've shared some knowledge here and some wisdom that most folks don't commonly think about when we think about policing and when we think about the history and culture of policing. I'm of the firm belief that if you're going to understand anything and change it, you have to understand where it came from and its origins. And so understanding the origins of policing in this country can only serve to educate us and make us more effective in changing the culture of policing today. So thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. All right, Connie.
Man, that was a fast-paced
show.
Wow. I hope y'all still with us out there? Y'all still with us?
Just know you can follow Chad and I both on social media. I am Friday Jones on Twitter and Instagram.
Yep, I am Chad_Boogie, but as I always say, don't follow me if you don't love Black people, y'all.
All right.
And that's the truth. But this has been a great show, Friday. One of the things I want to do with this platform is make sure we're always having substantive conversations and that we're always bringing it from an ADOS perspective, right? And we're always talking about the data, the history, and we're bringing it all full forward to today because we got to make change. We know in this community we got to have change or else,
And our ultimate change, as we all know, is reparations. HR 40 and S10, I think it's 83 on the Senate side are the current reparations bills on the table. We're seeing a lot in police reform. We're seeing a lot with COVID-19 and COVID recovery. But as ADOS, our primary goal and mission is the wealth inequity that has been created and basically maintained through segregation, through racism,
policing.
Yeah, post-emancipation. Our ancestors essentially worked for free and free labor. 25% of the rural land in the United States is still owned by families that receive land grants for being nothing other than white and moving as immigrants into the United States. And so in order for descendants of enslaved people who have been here just as long and unfortunately disenfranchised, for us, reparations is the cure.
Absolutely.
I like to say wherever there was anti-Negro legislation, let there be pro-Negro legislation. So on that note,
I need that on a T-shirt.
Thank you so much for joining us at Politics in Black.
Fam.
We will be back on July 12th, second Sunday, and the last Sunday in July.
4 to 5 p.m.
4 p.m. to 5 p.m.
Absolutely.
Peace and blessings, y'all.
Come back for the next episode of Politics in Black, y'all. Till next time.